All right, cool. Thank you. Let's talk about clouds and clouds. Cool. So here's a little bit about me. Live out here in Austin, Texas, and I work for Wiz. I used to work for Palo Alto, Puppet Labs, PlayStation. So a lot of cloud experience, at least that kind of clouds. And then also kind of an amateur astronomer. So sort of shake my fist at clouds too, because you can't see through them. I've been doing operations forever, cloud stuff, automation, and I do love playing with RFID and ambient notification and staring at the sky. Here's my stack of pancakes for you. We're going to talk about cloud security first. Give you the basics. This is an introductory talk. This is for folks who are getting into this stuff. Not necessarily the hardcore, although hopefully the hardcore folks will learn something too. I've got what I consider to be the top 5 threats and defenses in the cloud this year, based on a number of sources, then kind of ranking them myself. And I'll finish up the cloud security side of the pancake with just some overall advice before flipping the pancake over to the real cloud side of things. We'll talk about the basics because everything's introductory. I'll tell you why clouds form, and then we'll also look at some of the cloud types that are out there. So without further ado, let's start on the cloud security side of things. The basics. In the cloud, what you've got is what the cloud providers call the shared responsibility model. It really quite simply is a way for them to say that we'll keep everything running, the credit card machine swiping, the data centers cranking, and your choices are your responsibility. So how you configure the cloud and what you run on it, those are your part of the responsibility. This can be a little misunderstood sometimes. Sometimes folks don't realize that the responsibility really is shifted that far into your camp. And so some of the really general things that you'll notice are that folks will misconfigure things because they don't really know how to configure them. Identity is fundamentally different in the cloud, and so folks will make mistakes there. One of the general mistakes of moving to the cloud, folks will try to move legacy tools out there for an environment that's moving fast, that has tons of services that you've never seen before. Legacy tools, they don't really cover everything that you need. And fundamentally, you don't control the infrastructure. Virtual machines, sure, you control those. But things like databases, things like your storage buckets, you don't have control over the underlying infrastructure. So some of the methods of visibility that traditionally we've used just kind of don't work. I pulled together a ton of data sources. These were trade groups, user groups, and vendor reports. Every vendor has their this year in cloud security report. So took a look at some of those, looked at what user groups are talking about, and then trade groups naturally expand that. Then I filtered it based on kind of my experience and sort of, is it particularly a cloudy thing? So things like patching your systems, it happens on premises and in the cloud. So patching systems is not necessarily something to put on the list of cloud threats, rather than look at things like misconfigurations or exposure or identity. Some of this is hype. I think probably number 3 on my top 5 list is it's questionable whether it's hype or not. And have I seen it? These are the things that I have seen. So what I'll do is I'll talk about the problem, and I'll talk about potential solutions. For misconfiguration, that's really the top one that I see. Compromised credentials, those are making up something like 80% of all attacks now. Number 3, I'm not entirely sold, but increasing sophistication comes up a lot. I don't know if it's hype or not. I know I can go either way, and so I'll explain both ways. Insecure APIs and lack of visibility round out the list. So let's take a look one at a time. Misconfiguration. This is the number one problem. Defaults are frequently insecure. Um, you end up you get confused sometimes around identity and around permissions, and so you'll open things up to just make it work. Um, Part of that is because there are built-in roles in the cloud, so you can create your own fine-grained role-based access control, but there are also built-in roles in the cloud that do the trick. And so you can give someone a read-only account, but then they can read everything, for instance. And cloud native considerations come into play as well. Um, the the number of knobs that you can change on a cloud resource can be pretty impressive, particularly because the cloud providers are trying to cater to a lot of different people and make sure that folks can get what they want and that they can customize it the way that they need it. The double-edged sword is there's a lot of customizing that you can do. So misconfiguration is really a big issue. Um, as an example, there's a webcam site that was using an Elastic database, and one of the nice things about an Elastic database, nice maybe in quotes, is that the default config was passwordless, at least when they were implementing it then, and they gave it a public IP. So things that individually might not have been a real issue, they combined together into this misconfiguration that left them open, and attackers just grabbed everything that they could find in the database, including a lot of personal information. So one of the counters to that then is to be able to deeply analyze what you've got and shift left. If you haven't heard the term shift left, what it is a philosophy of getting security embedded in the development process. So even before things get into production. And part of how you do that is by using infrastructure as code. And to secure the cloud, using things like Terraform, your Kubernetes YAML files, Docker, things like that. It's easiest to solve a problem in development before it gets to production. So what you'll find are numerous tools, open source and commercial, that make this easier for you, that let your developers check out the configuration before it even gets into production. Oftentimes, you'll be able to integrate this right into their development pipeline. So that's probably having that deep kind of analysis is important, and shifting it so that the developers are also doing part of it. That is essential. Compromised credentials. These are a major attack vector. Some of it's just boring password reuse and stuffing passwords just to see what you can get. But also, credentials can get cached in interesting places. And so, your laptop might be a safe place to run your AWS, your AZ, your different command line tools. When you log in, your credentials often get cached on your system. And one of the things that I've seen a lot of actually is Bastion hosts will end up with just a ton of credentials sitting around on them in people's user directories, and they don't realize. So that's a good one to look for there. They'll also, sort of a double-edged sword of infrastructure as code, is that they'll end up hard-coded in things like Terraform or CloudFormation. And that's exactly what happened with, let's see, I think it was Department of Transportation. They had cloud credentials for Google Cloud in their version control inside their infrastructure as code. They pushed it to GitHub, where those credentials were spotted, most likely by a bot. There are bots that just sit there and watch for this stuff. And unfortunately, these keys were set as a project admin. Again, could have been just an innocent mistake where somebody just needed something to work. And so they created somebody as a project admin just to get it to work. Well, that led to tons of coin mining instances for them and a bit of a cloud bill. The other one, the really topical one, is the password manager that's on everyone's mind these days, where they actually had a laptop compromised. So caching your credentials on your laptop could be iffy. The laptop was compromised. A keylogger actually watched them type in a master password for a work vault. They had no MFA on this, and the the company had AWS credentials that had S3 access that allowed the downloading of the password vaults, including some internal ones. The possible solutions, the ways to go to protect yourself from this, are indeed least privilege. So no reason why that Google service account had project admin. So least privilege is very important. There are tools out there that can spot that for you. Multi-factor authentication. This is pretty essential, especially for important data sources. So that compromised laptop that didn't have MFA around the key vault, MFA would have helped out there. And one of the more fun ones is to use canary values or canary tokens. The purpose of those is you set up some credentials that can't really do too much. Maybe they can just log in and then leave them sort of sprinkled about in your environment and in your infrastructure as code, so that if things do get leaked and a bot spots it, it'll log into an account that doesn't have a lot of privilege. You'll see the login and you'll know that something was compromised inside your version control. Number 3, controversial to me, but kind of not once I really started to get into it. But folks do talk a lot about the increasing sophistication of attacks. And spear phishing is definitely one of them. Automating things over APIs are one of them. And I put price war on here because I think that it's important to realize that the credentials aren't worth a lot of money, at least in bulk. A full on you might be worth $5, or a card might be worth $5, depending on what kind of balance it has on it. So, in order to capture a lot of that information, folks do have to kind of automate and get a little more clever. Otherwise, it's not worth money. You'll spot automated discovery bots out there. Right now, a lot of them we're seeing are hitting VMware ESX. There are those bots that are watching GitHub to see if there are credentials out there. In fact, some white hat folks will actually email you when they spot your stuff rather than using it for bad. So both sides are automating. That's good. And another one that's really interesting and that is particular about the cloud is that because resources can be spun up and spun down so quickly with just an API request, some adversaries are now spinning up a system to do one thing, then spin it back down, then spin up another one to do something, then spin it back down to avoid detection. They're not in one place long enough. And I think the big popular one people are talking about now is ChatGPT and the possibility that large language models will be able to write phishing emails and things like that. I think the jury's still out on that one. We'll see what happens. Deep fakes, those are going to get interesting. We just saw somebody do a proof of concept where they faked someone's voice to authenticate against their bank. I think the example that actually really turned me around on the sophistication of attacks was that phishing outfits are starting to actually purchase ads on Google on their search results and stealing cloud keys. So to defend against this, it's important to have some sort of analysis that's looking at how users are behaving, how those service keys are behaving. Um, if you can do it, automate remediation. I mean, I worked at Puppet Labs, so I welcome the robot army, and patch, uh, automatically patch if you can. But patch, it's so interesting. Increasing sophistication, I think, comes up against the reality also that folks are using old exploits. There are systems that aren't patched for years. Maybe it's something propped up. Maybe it's something somebody forgot about. I think one of the fun things about the cloud is, if we're going to talk, double-edged swords, um, is is that you really can actually see all that stuff quite easily, since everything's virtual, and plenty of APIs for us to work with as well. So if adversaries are starting to use APIs, then we can actually counter it with similar tools. Here's one that I'm not sure is entirely cloudy, but as we move to the cloud, we're using more and more APIs and creating more and more APIs. And especially the past, I'm going to say 3 years, APIs have been a major problem for security. Part of that is because they're just poorly understood and not governed. Um, Part of that is folks thinking that a firewall can solve it, or that a web application firewall can solve it. It's interesting because the attacks that happen, a firewall would assume that they were legitimate anyway. Um, so without some sort of behavioral analysis, firewall is just going to let stuff through because it looks valid. And POC stands for production on completion, and that's what happens to a lot of APIs. Is somebody has a need to pull some information out of something, and so they'll create a quick API to be able to fetch that information. Then it'll become really useful, and then it'll become part of the app. And along the path, there was never any security done on it. Now it's business critical, and so you can't take it down. So to reiterate the last slide, behavioral security is getting more and more important. Uh, Microsegmentation with APIs, and especially things like containers and serverless functions, is a lot easier because each piece only does one thing. We're starting to see a shift also to policy as code. So if I write the firewall rules, or if I write the behavioral rules, uh, and I'm a developer, I'm gonna have a very accurate feeling for what should be happening, what kind of behavior is expected, or which pieces should be talking to which pieces. So if I can write the security policy and keep it in the same place as my application code, I can actually help out quite a bit. You almost call it shift left, because you are involving developers in security way at the start. And then naturally look out for the OWASP top 10. They have a top 10 list for APIs now. Um, there have been a couple of examples, actually, with a couple of cell phone companies, not just one, with publicly facing APIs that either lacked authentication or didn't really care about authentication. And so you look at the one in Australia. I'm specifically not mentioning names because I don't want anybody getting in trouble. But if you look at them, they had a public facing API. There was no authentication on it, and they had sequential user IDs. So it allowed somebody to dump 9.8 million users, 2 million of them with government issued ID listed in their information, just by iterating through the API, as far as we know. And to put the 9.8 million users in perspective, Australia's whole population is actually only 25 million. Here's number 5 for me. It's lack of visibility. Folks start their journey often with a lift and shift. So taking all the virtual machines that I've got on site and then putting them into the cloud and hoping that things will act the same. There are rogue deployments in the cloud where somebody's given an account, they know it's easy to kick off extra workloads in the cloud, and so they'll create extra things. Dependency sprawl is a real thing, and it's starting to bite a lot of us. That all sorts of software needs all sorts of other packages, and the sprawl can be quite extensive. And I put ClickOps on here because if you do get one or two things from this talk, I think that should be that using programs to configure your cloud is the way to go, because they're reproducible, that you can rerun them. Also, everything's written down, so you've got a certain amount of documentation. With that, you'll either have a full inventory because everything's programmatic, or there are plenty of tools out there that'll give you a full inventory. We're starting to see more pushes for bills of materials, and infrastructure as code is a great way to go about this stuff. As an example, I think probably the last four things on my list are each examples of a lack of visibility. If you've got a coin mining operation going on, you need to be able to spot the uptick in instances. That's a visibility thing. The webcam site that got its database dumped, a simple check for misconfigurations would have shown you the visibility of a database with a public IP. And just inventorying things like your APIs, even, and the behavior that you expect is valuable in the cloud. Overall, just to round it out, if you're getting started out in the cloud, make sure you've got some tools at the start to look at your configuration, your visibility, make sure your APIs are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Always monitor. Don't just check things in staging before they go to production. You should be following this stuff continuously. And get ready to learn a bunch about cloud technology. It's some really neat stuff. Some really cool possibilities. Unfortunately, some of them are cool possibilities for attackers, but they're cool possibilities for defenders as well. As you mature, I would recommend shifting the conversation to the left, getting developers to buy in, getting developers to use cloud native tricks like infrastructure as code, and engaging your peers is just essential. I think one of my favorite examples is when folks have internal capture the flags against their own tools. I think that's kind of a fun way to have a little fun, but also do some real work at the same time. All right, now let's talk about real clouds.
Sorry, Gabe, do you want me
sure.
to ask you some questions now, or do you want to keep them until the end of everything?
Go for it. Let's do it.
Okay, so jumping in, I've got a question that says, do CVE scores ever change based on the sophistication increase, where vulnerabilities that weren't considered easily exploitable become targeted?
I don't know. I know that CVEs are reviewed, and that they'll change the score sometimes. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one, I'm afraid.
Okay, all right. Well, let's move on. Okay, so do we think phishing training is going to be a thing in the future? So the ability to, I guess, in terms of what you were talking about earlier, with more AI being able to trick people into recognizing people's voices and stuff, it might become important that we can.
It's gonna be mayhem when you can do a deep fake to call someone on Zoom and ask them to deposit everything into an account. I think probably in terms of that, I think probably I think we have tools that can help us. I'm big on behavioral analysis, so I think a system that can tell you this transaction looks fishy, for lack of a better word. I think we need better tools. I think I'm not alone in thinking that the phishing training, I don't know, I don't like it. The training for sure, yeah. And then I do think there are some tools. I think technology needs to play a bigger role in protecting us.
Okay. And I suppose on that same topic of technology, do you think CSPM or CIEM tools would help address misconfiguration and identity
Mhm.
vulnerabilities, or is it too complex to use those kind of
Yeah.
tools?
No, I love those tools.
Hmm.
Um, Obviously, from where I work and where I have worked, I love uh, automating security. And to answer the question and expand the acronyms,
Hmm.
CSPM stands for Cloud Security Posture Management. And that's the part of the shared responsibility model that's how you configure things. So there are
Hmm.
tools, commercial and open source, that will assess the configuration of your cloud looking for security issues. And then CIEM or CIEM is cloud infrastructure entitlement management, and that looks at identity and susses out the the way that service accounts or users or workloads themselves can use the cloud on their own to
Okay.
determine that least privilege. And then the other acronym that you're going to hear as you start to do this is CWPP, and that's short for Cloud Workload Protection Platform. And that's the what you run side of things. It's sort of a grandchild of endpoint defense to some extent, but with a cloudy feeling to it.
Hmm. Okay. All right.
We
Yep.
got it.
No, that's fine.
That's
Yep.
it.
Good.
All right.
That's all the questions I've had up until now. Yeah. Let's jump into real clouds,
Perfect.
I guess.
All right. Let's talk about real clouds, which this was a lot of fun to put together, um, especially because I swear one of these days somebody's going to introduce a talk on clouds, and I'm going to get up there and I'm going to give this part of the talk completely deadpan. So here are my data sources. So Center for Science Education is a ton of fantastic stuff about weather. Um, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration has their own National Severe Storms Laboratory. And then also just weather broadcasters are tons of fun information if you're into weather and clouds and have questions. I think you know as technologists we get kind of a rap for going crazy when you hit on one of our subjects and just you can't shut us up after that. Weather broadcasters really love what they do, um, and so they tweet about it, they write about it. Um, the My criteria for picking things were whether it sounded right, but whether it agreed with others as well. Some stuff just kind of stood on its own that it didn't really sound right. But the caveat is I don't have meteorologist friends, so I don't really know. Um, the kind of fun trivia about meteorologists is actually that Aristotle wrote what's considered to be the first book about meteorology, called it Meteorologica. Um, other trivia to start you off on are that the study of clouds is actually called nephology, and that weather broadcasters they'll often put WX in their online handles and things. Turns out WX is Morse code shorthand for weather. So that's why you see that. Let's get into it. The basics, just like technology cloud, I'm going to give you the basics of water clouds. On our planet, at least, water exists in three different forms. You've got ice crystals, you've got liquid water, and you've got vapor. Vapor is the invisible around us, and of course, liquid, that's going to be your raindrops, and then ice is going to be the snow. Um, the thing that's important to realize in cloud is that temperature affects what form water is found in, and temperature goes down as you go up in altitude. So this is the vast oversimplification is that if you suppose that the dew point, which is the temperature at which vapor turns into liquid and vice versa, if the dew point is pretty standard where you are, and you go up in altitude, vapor down near the surface hits a certain point where it starts to condense, and that's what a cloud is. That's all it is. It is probably easiest to think about it in terms of the way that in cold weather, when you breathe out, you see a cloud. That's kind of what's going on. So super simple there. NASA estimates about a third of the Earth's surface is covered by clouds. So they are very important to us as just a planet. They can reflect sunlight or they can retain sunlight. Another fun thing about clouds that I learned was that they actually have a weight to them. You might not think about it, but they're the vapor when it condenses, that's water, and so they can a normal sized cloud can have about the same weight as a jetliner. The measurement of how much cloud cover there is when those weather people are doing their measurements is something called an octa. It measures eighths of the sky. So if you have two eighths of the sky covered, that's 2 octaves. And clouds don't have to be water. On our planet, yeah, but on Venus, their clouds are made out of sulfur dioxide, and Jupiter and Saturn have ammonia clouds. So any place you can get that vapor to turn to condense, you can have a cloud. So why do clouds show up in the places that they show up? There are a couple of tricks. Starting with warm on the surface, bottom left there. Just warm water on the surface, rising up, hits the point where it's cold enough that it condenses. You can also have mountains push a bunch of warm air up. So the air runs into the mountain, goes up, and as it goes up, it cools and condenses. The bottom right picture there is a view of having a low pressure spot and have air rushing in from different sides. It'll run into itself and go up and create clouds that way. And then the one I didn't really understand until now was that warm air and cold air at the same altitude can run into each other. The cold air is denser, it goes down, the warm air goes up, and as it hits that temperature spot, it will form a cloud. It's also interesting to note that clouds do not have to be outdoors. There are large structures like blimp hangars that will actually have clouds indoors. Also, there are clouds caused by forest fires. You can intentionally add condensation, what they call condensation nuclei, to the air to seed clouds, to make clouds. And oddly enough, actually, the US military has experimented with that during Vietnam. They were trying to make the monsoon seasons longer, of all things. The UN ended up banning what they call weaponized weather shortly after that. Speaking of the monsoons, here's why rain happens. At the very simplest, it can happen just because a cloud hits saturation of how much water it can condense, and it comes out as precipitation. That's just the simplest. You'll also, for bigger rain clouds, you'll end up with what are called cells, which is actually a churning of light and heavy updrafts and downdrafts that make a cycle in them. There's a fun case of this called virga, which is where precipitation comes down through the bottom of the cloud and then it re-evaporates and heads right back up into the cloud. Very interesting. Um, the world record for straight days of measurable rainfall is held, believe it or not, in Oregon. 1997 in Otis, Oregon. They had 79 straight days of measurable rainfall. But the record for discontinuous, Guinness World Records credits Kauai with a record of up to 350 days of rain per year. Not the straight 79 days, but individual days, but that is a heck of a lot. And when it rains, there can be lightning. So here's why lightning happens. It's actually interesting to note that the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration says it's still kind of up for debate what makes lightning happen. But in general, the theories have a cell in them where things are churning. Ice churning in the cloud will transfer electrons as it runs into itself. So making a static charge by rubbing against itself, and then opposites attract in the electrical world. So if you end up with positive charges up at the top and negative at the bottom, what you'll see is the negatives, sometimes they'll jump to the positives inside the cloud and you'll see flashing inside the cloud. Other times they'll hit the ground. The world record for number of times of getting struck by lightning in your entire lifetime is actually 7. Guy named Roy Sullivan, the park ranger in Virginia, got struck 7 times by lightning in like years apart, not even all at once, which gave him the nickname the Spark Ranger after about 4 of those, I think. That's not surprising when you realize that at any moment there are about 2,000 thunderstorms going on somewhere on the planet. Here's some common types. The Wikipedia page for types of clouds is long. But what we have in general is a nomenclature came from a British chemist somewhere around 1800, which is that depending on the height of a cloud, you can call it stratus, alto, or cirro. And depending on the form of a cloud, you can distinguish between cumulus, stratus, and cirrus clouds. And nimbus really just seems to indicate that it's going to rain. So those are the general types of clouds. You'll want to check out the Wikipedia page if you're crazy, because they'll combine things to call something, for instance, an alto cumulus, which are small puffy ones, but in a mid-height, cirrocumulus when you get up higher. And of course, there are all sorts of other types. You've got airplane contrails, things like that. And that is my talk about clouds and clouds. Do we have any questions while I was in there?
Just the one question: is there a minimum size for a cloud?
Not that I know of. Especially if you look at something like contrails, which are just a strip of ice. The high up clouds get pretty wispy and small. There are even some that we can't spot during the daylight because the sun's too bright.